I was a camp counselor during the midnight massacre at Camp Greenleaf. A simple job, that's what I thought it would be. Just helping kids during summertime with all the camping activities, good, wholesome fun, and a feeling of pride being a small, special part of the summertime joy that all the kids would remember when they were my age. I never got to go to summer camp, so I thought it would be nice to experience all the entertainment and memories alongside a new generation. I was sure everyone would have a great time, that is, until the killings started. I still feel guilty that I survived when so many were slain. I could have done more. I should have done more. I don't know how or why it all happened. When it was over, I couldn't believe what had happened or who the police said was the perpetrator. The trauma and fear of the situation will stay with me forever, but at least I survived. My friends and campers did not. I will recount what I remember to honor their memory and make my face my own failure to protect them. I know I could have done more, but if it was really who I suspect it was, would I have been able to stop them? It was the first week of summer, and I was headed to Camp Greenleaf with the other counselors. The day was beautiful, and the scenic vista of the camp and the nearby lake glistening in the morning light was an inspiring sight. With me were 3 other counselors, Chelsea, Glenn, and Whitney. They all looked fresh out of high school, and I seemed to be the oldest by a bit. Whitney had been sitting next to me on the bus, so I tried to talk with her a bit, but she seemed disinterested and was mostly on her phone the whole time. Meanwhile, Glenn was making an awkward attempt at hitting on Chelsea, who continued to roll her eyes and try to ignore his attempts at small talk. Despite the disinterest of my fellow counselors, I was ready to get started. We got off the bus and were met by a bear of a man who gave us a brief introduction and overview of what to expect in our roles as camp counselors. The man leading the meeting was the director and head of Camp Greenleaf, Mr. Johnston, though he insisted we refer to him as Ken, or Coach, since he also worked as a high school football coach during the school year. Remember, we are a team, we work together, we do our best, and everyone will have a great summer. He finished with a flourish and a raised fist, like he expected us to give him a standing ovation. I felt bad at the lack of response, so I shouted back, "Yeah, let's do it." Ken smiled approvingly, while my fellow counselors judged me in silence with condescending looks. This was going to be rough if I had to remain the only optimistic one besides the director. Later that day, the campers arrived. We were a bit short considering we were supposed to have over 20 kids, but only 12 arrived. Apparently, the camp had a reputation, and some kids had heard disturbing rumors about it and refused to go. It seemed like a bad omen, but I promised myself I would help make the time for the kids who did show up as great as possible. I got to meet most of the campers, and despite being discouraged by the small number, it did mean we had more time to spend with each one. My excitement was diluted when I realized a lot of them seemed uninterested in most of what the camp and all of us had to offer. The general apathy as soon as they arrived was palpable. They were high schoolers, and to my dismay, seemed more inclined to ignore our attempts at instruction and activities and stay glued to their phones. Only one of the campers spoke directly to us. Her name was Beatrice, or B for short. She was a little shy, though she seemed nice. Unfortunately, she was a bit of a pariah and was picked on by most of the other kids. The only thing that could pull their attention away from their phones was a verbal jab or some trick or prank they tried to pull at B's expense. I tried to put a stop to it, but it was always in passive-aggressive ways that were tough to catch and call out the offenders. Most of the girls ignored me anyway and continued to harass B throughout the day. We had a very busy day of activities and orientation. Many of the kids did start to have fun when they realized they had a lot more to do than just sit around on social media. Glenn and I showed the boys to their cabins, while Whitney and Chelsea showed the girls to theirs. Even as we parted into our groups, I saw Beatrice looking sullen, and I saw more of the girls snickering at her behind her back. It was tough to watch, but I couldn't do much to interfere. Later at night, Ken had arranged a counselor meeting, and he seemed very odd. He was normally very cheery, practically dripping with enthusiasm. Now, though, despite arranging the meeting, he seemed disinterested and almost paranoid. It seemed like he kept looking over his shoulder and, at several points, had even asked us, "Do you all hear that chiming sound in the distance?" We all listened carefully, but none of us could. "I can go take a look and see if some of the kids left their cabins and are messing around with some of the trinkets in the storage shed. I know there was an old cowbell out there," I offered. Glenn interrupted quickly, saying, "I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell," in a terrible Christopher Walken impression. I laughed, despite the interruption. Whitney and Chelsea either didn't get it or didn't care, while Ken glowered at him. We sat back down, and Ken muttered again, "I hear something out there. Someone is messing with me." We sat in awkward silence a bit longer, until he told us we could leave without even discussing tomorrow's agenda, which had been the whole reason for the meeting. We all thought it was very strange, but we started for the door. On the way out, I thought I saw Ken moving toward a cabinet and heard the clinking of glass bottles. I tried to talk to Whitney and Chelsea about Bea and the girls bullying her. They seemed distracted by how Ken was acting and brushed me off, saying they would take care of it, though I was not sure if they had really heard me. I gave up the attempt and returned to my cabin. Wasting no time, I put the light out and fell asleep. I don't know how long I was out, but I remember being awoken by an odd chiming sound in the night. It was faint, not so loud that it woke everyone up, but noticeable to those who were light sleepers. Hadn't Ken said he heard a bell or chime or something? I saw a few lights come on in the boys' cabin and figured a few campers had heard the sound too. I almost wrote it off and was about to go back to sleep when a tortured scream came from the director's cabin. I got up and rushed over to check it out. I was not alone in hearing the sound. Whitney and Glenn waited with the few campers who were awakened by the commotion, while Chelsea and I went to look inside. It was a bad scene, and we couldn't find Ken anywhere. The cabin had been thrashed. It looked like a bear had gone through it. The walls were shredded and the furniture smashed, with no sign of him. I saw a few bottles on the ground near his chair and thought maybe this was some sort of weird drunken outburst and maybe he had left to clear his head. That did not explain the terrible damage to the cabin, though. That drunk bastard left us alone with these kids. What an asshole! Chelsea blurted out, letting her real feelings be known. "Yeah, I don't know what the hell is going on, but it's not good," I responded. We were almost ready to leave empty-handed, but I noticed something strange near the desk. It was an odd little black box that, upon closer inspection, had been slightly opened. Inside was a soft padded interior and a recess that looked like it was made for some type of mask. This was really strange. Neither of us knew what the significance was, but I didn't like the chill I felt when I held the box. I could swear I heard an ethereal chime in the distance that beckoned me. Chelsea looked at me, confused and upset. I realized I had been holding the box, staring off into space. "Are we leaving or what?" she demanded. I shook my head, came out of the daze, and responded, "Sorry, not sure what came over me. Let's go tell the others that Ken's gone." Back outside, we met up with Whitney and Glenn to tell them the news. They were annoyed, but not as surprised, since Glenn had known about Ken's drinking and had even said he would sometimes take random breaks for super long periods of time. He must have figured Ken was out getting hammered somewhere right now, but I was not so sure. If he was drunk, why wreck his whole office? Why leave in the middle of the night and not finish all his booze here, for that matter? None of this felt right. As we considered the problem at hand, we heard a shrill scream from the girls' cabin. Whitney and Chelsea rushed ahead, concern plain on their faces since they had left their wards unattended to look into the matter of the disappearing director. We rushed on and saw the girls had all left the cabin and were standing outside. Then we see panicking and screaming. As we got closer, I asked one of them what had happened, and the only girl who had her wits still intact said that someone killed them. She was horrified like her friends, but still seemed cogent, so I asked her if she saw what happened. A big man with a creepy mask. He had a weird chime when he stepped, was holding an axe. She tapered off into sobbing. I tried to comfort her, but it was a bad scene. Other girls had similar accounts. They said someone or something had killed their friends. Glenn tapped me on the shoulder just then and told me that some of the girls said they had seen a large man exit the cabin shortly before the other girls woke up and saw their murdered friends. I heard another scream and saw Chelsea and Whitney emerge from the girls' cabin, ghost white. Chelsea looked dazed, and Whitney threw up. "Grace and Sasha are dead," Chelsea muttered, barely able to parse the words through her obvious shock and horror. Glenn was trying to comfort Whitney, who was struggling to recover. I raised my voice and quickly asserted, "We need to call the police now. We need to get everyone together in the rec center and lock the doors. Has anyone seen Ken?" There was an awkward pause and looks back and forth to see if anyone had. Chelsea spoke up again. "He got drunk, wrecked his office, and now 2 kids are dead. I don't think we should rule out that he may have been responsible for this," she said with a grim look accompanying the heavy accusation. "Whoa, wait, you think Ken would kill kids? Why would he do that? He has run this camp for 20 years. How and why would he do that?" I asked in shocked disbelief, though my tone betrayed the slowly creeping feeling of acceptance in Chelsea's reasoning. I hated to believe it, but maybe she was right and he had just snapped. Before we could get into a back and forth about Ken and his motives, there was a horrible flash and explosion, and the boys' cabin burst into flames. We raced over to find a raging fire where the cabin had been. A fiery explosion had engulfed it, and to my dawning horror, I realized the boys had still been in there. We hadn't had a chance to bring everyone to the rec cabin as we planned. I clutched my head in my hands, gaping at the horror of the situation when I saw movement near the flaming ruin. It was a tall figure shuffling forward, murmuring something. I thought it was Jacob, one of the taller kids, but then I realized he was too large. I stopped moving forward and stared in disbelief when I saw it was someone else. He was burned by the flames, with what appeared to be charred blood on his hands and shirt. He held a wood-cutting axe in both hands and wore a horrible pallid mask with a small chime connected to the top, like the bobber on an anglerfish. It tinkled when he stomped forward, providing a jarring discordance with the huge figure's thundering footsteps. Glenn stepped forward, brandishing an oar from the canoes, and in a quavering voice said, "Back off! I'm warning you, man! Leave us alone!" He swung the oar back and forth to illustrate the point. The masked man stopped moving and fell to his knees, clutching his head and letting out a pained scream. Through gritted teeth, we heard the words in an all-too-familiar voice. "Help me, Glenn, help!" We all realized that voice was Ken's. Had he snapped after all? Glenn realized it was the director and moved forward cautiously. Ken was sobbing now, his arms outstretched. Glenn got closer and asked, "Mr. Johnston, what happened? What did you do?" Before any of us could blink, Ken grabbed Glenn's arm and stuttered out, You all need to leave now. That sound, I can't stop myself. I can't. His body went momentarily inert, like a marionette with its strings cut. Before Glenn could even whisper a response, Ken sat bolt upright, seized Glenn by the throat, and lifted him up. Then he threw him into the side of the burning cabin. Glenn screamed as the flames licked at his clothes, and before any of us could move to help, Mr. Johnston had raised the axe and embedded it into Glenn's head with a wet crunch. All of us screamed in unison at the cold-blooded murder we had just witnessed. There was another awful ripping sound as the axe came free from Glenn's lifeless body, and the soulless eyes of the director-turned-murderer faced us. Whitney and Chelsea screamed and ran, and I also turned to flee. I remember seeing Beatrice standing outside the girls' cabin, looking at the spectacle. I ran towards her and implored her to get back inside and lock the doors, but she just gently smiled, shook her head, and pointed at me. I was confused by the gesture, but I thought I heard the faint sound of a bell and saw something in her other hand. I ran towards her, but something struck me hard in the back of the head, and everything went dark. I woke up hours later in the girls' cabin. Beatrice was the only one there with me. She said the others had all been killed. The way she said it was oddly calm and dispassionate. Later, the police arrived, and it was determined the perpetrator of the terrible killings had been Ken Johnston. Drunk and driven into a homicidal rage, he had killed almost every single camper and all the counselors but me. Police found him outside the cabins, face down and soaked in blood, surrounded by more corpses, Found on his person was a gore-encrusted woodcutting axe and an odd mask with a chime on it. Later, I heard that he insisted in his insanity plea that the mask made me do it. It spoke to me. Ken was later found guilty and sentenced to execution. During the trial, it was discovered that he had a real dark side to him. Evidence revealed that he had abused several campers in the past and either paid them off or threatened them to stay quiet. One case from around 16 years ago stated that he had raped a camper, and she had even gotten pregnant. Somehow he had kept it under wraps and paid the mother to keep quiet. The disturbing thing is that the mother had died recently, and the name of the surviving child was Beatrice Larkin. I considered the only other survivor from that horrible night and thought about the implications. She was the right age and at the camp he worked at, no less. Then I remembered the odd chiming sound and the hint of a memory replayed in my head of her holding a small bell, hearing it chime in tune with the disturbing mask's chime, and the bellows of pain and forced motion of Mr. Johnston as he moved in time with the chiming sound. What the hell was that bell, and what was it really doing? I don't know what really happened, though I suspect some impossible things. I never saw her again.